Do you struggle with bird photography? Wildlife photography in general? Bird photography always seemed kind of out of reach for me, even after 23 years of nature photography experience. I considered myself an opportunistic birder, so if I was photographing a landscape and a bird happened to land in my scene, yay, but otherwise I never really sought out to just go shoot birds. In this video, you're going to learn 5 things that can hopefully save you years of trial and error and a ton of frustration if you are a beginner bird photographer. So after the long lens that I purchased 2 years ago collected just enough dust in my closet, I pulled that thing out and decided I was going to challenge myself to do some bird photography. So this past spring, I set myself up with this little challenge. I was going to go to the same location at least once a week for 3 months. And I was just going to get better at bird photography. I went out there to learn, to fail miserably, and to eventually get better at it. So the first lesson that I learned was that the smaller the bird, the harder they are to capture. Those little suckers are fast. So my suggestion, if you are just starting down the road of bird photography, start with bigger birds. They're slower, they're a little bit easier to predict where they're going because they're not flitting all over the place. It's easier to fill your frame with them, which is quite satisfying, actually. Capturing these larger birds is going to give you a few more keepers, I think, and so that will encourage you to kind of keep learning and keep practicing, and then you can move on to the smaller subjects later. My second lesson for you guys is that what you think is fast probably isn't. 1/1000th of a second sounds fast, especially when I've been a landscape photographer for 23 years, and 1/500th of a second sounded fast, but when it comes to birds, especially birds in flight or smaller birds, again, start with the bigger ones, but the smaller birds, it's not nearly enough. And that shutter speed is not just dependent on the bird and how fast it's moving through your frame. A lot of it has to do with you as a photographer, your equipment, how long of the lens that you're using, how steady you are if you're hand holding or if you're on a tripod. For me personally, when I'm shooting with my long lens, I either have to be on a fluid head or a tripod, or if I'm hand holding, I typically don't shoot below 1/1600th of a second. I'm usually around 1/2000th, even with the slower birds. And that's just because I'm shaky. So here's some basic numbers to kind of get you going. Okay, so for those larger birds that I was talking about, you can probably get away with 1/1600th of a second, but again, that's on the slow side. To be safe, I would go 3200, 1/3200th of a second, just to make sure that you are getting those, especially if we're talking about birds in flight. So if they're moving, you want to be able to keep up and you want to be able to capture that nice and sharp. For some of the mid-sized birds, like birds of prey, hawks and eagles and things like this, or seagulls, 1/3200th is probably going to be my starting point, and I might push it to 1/4000th just to make sure that I'm getting those guys sharp as well, because they do move faster than those herons. Now, if we're talking smaller birds, the birds that are coming to the feeder in your backyard, those songbirds, birds of spring, I might go as slow as 1/3200th of a second, but I'm probably going to be at 1/4000th, and if I'm in my comfort zone where I know I'm going to get it sharp, it's going to be 1/4500th or 5000th of a second. That's fast! Okay, lesson number 3 is probably one that most people won't talk about, because we talk about, continuous shooting mode, which I'll get to in a little bit, and the types of lenses and tripods and things like that. But what about the memory card that you're using? If you are shooting in that continuous shooting mode where you are just holding down the button and click, 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 clicking away, that buffer in your camera is going to fill up. So your clicking, clicking, clicking is going to come to a screeching halt if you do not have a card with a fast write speed. So this is the number that I'm talking about right here. It's on that little memory card that you've got that you put in your camera. You want that to be fast because it takes time for the camera to take the image and for the data that is being recorded on the sensor to be written to the card. It takes time. My cards are at about 200 megabytes per second, and I am shooting 11 frames per second with a deep buffer, and I'm on a Sony A6700. So I have not really had a problem. The only time I had to wait before being able to shoot again was when I shot a few minutes of video and then I switched back to stills. So it only took a couple of seconds, and I'd hate for you to miss that decisive moment because of a memory card issue, and I'm afraid, yeah, faster means more expensive, so you get what you pay for. I think the fourth most important thing that I learned in my challenge was that not only do autofocus modes matter, obviously you need to be in continuous shooting mode, but the autofocus points matter. So it's pretty likely that you already know how continuous shooting mode works. Like I said earlier, you press the button and it just keeps shooting until you let go. The autofocus points, however, they get a little bit more complicated. So without getting into a full-blown class here, too much in the weeds, I'll just give you some basic advice that'll get you going when it comes to the autofocus points. So for birds in flight, on my Sony, I use zone autofocus. I would try this for a Canon camera as well. For a Nikon DSLR, I would use group autofocus. For Nikon's mirrorless cameras, I would probably use wide autofocus. But you'll have to experiment with these. This is not like one-click fix for everybody. All I really learned is that if the autofocus point areas is very small and very precise, it's difficult for me to maintain autofocus because I have a hard time, especially as a beginner, and especially as unsteady as I am, I have a hard time keeping that bird in the frame. And because of that, I'm going to rely on a few more autofocus points in the center of my frame for that. And I guess if I want to use less autofocus points, which is going to be more precise, I'm just going to have to get better. Guess I got to go out and practice more. So for stationary birds, you can probably get away with dynamic autofocus for Nikon, autofocus point expansion for Canon, and for my Sony, expanded flexible spot. There really is no one setting to rule them all, but this is good to kind of get you going as a beginner bird photographer like me. So my last major tip is that a little homework goes a long way. When I'm talking about homework, I'm talking about doing a little bit of research on the birds that you are planning to go out and photograph. Understanding bird behaviors, which is going to vary significantly from species to species, is going to help you to figure out where they are and when they're going to be there. Some birds are migratory and they only show up in your area at certain times of year. You're going to want to know when that is. You're going to want to know where they're roosting and where they're flying to for their daily meals. You'll start to recognize hunting behaviors, mating behaviors, how they treat their young, where they're caring for them. I'm not saying that you have to run out today and go get a degree in biology. I'm just saying do a little bit of research. Google is your friend when it comes to figuring out where those birds are going to be and how they might behave. And of course, practicing is going to make you a much better bird photographer. Okay, so here are some of the results of my efforts for the challenge of going out once a week for 3 straight months and watching these baby birds grow up. This was so much fun. I learned a ton. I learned more about backlighting, I think, than I really cared to learn in the first place. I mean, I understand backlighting because of my landscape days, but when it comes to moving animals, well, that's an entirely different animal. So my final little tip is to do something that I did that actually started this whole journey for me, and created this challenge in my mind that I wanted to take care of myself, is that I went out with a bird group. And I don't normally do that. I normally hang out with all my landscape photography friends. And if they're shooting birds, I might look over their shoulder. But I went out with a group of non-photographers, just a group of birders. I went on a bird walk, a public bird walk with a group, with a very knowledgeable guide. I learned a ton about the animals that I was photographing, and it really just sparked my interest and got me going as far as, all right, this is what I want to concentrate on this spring. And since then, I've been out a number of times just to photograph birds, which, like I said, is not something I ever did before. Sometimes even from my own kayak, which that's a whole separate issue right there. I might make a video on that one here at some point in the future, so go ahead and subscribe if you want to be informed about that one. That's always fun, photographing from a boat. And I've also taken a couple of trips down to the beach at dawn here to try and photograph the birds wading in the water as the morning sun comes up. It's all about the light. So by creating this challenge for myself, I ended up with a lot more confidence. I gained more skills. I feel much more comfortable photographing birds, and I have found something new and fun that has just invigorated me to get out and do photography more often. I still have a lot to learn though, but I'm going to enjoy that process. Let me know in the comments if you've ever done a photography challenge like this of your own and how that went. For you beginners out there, I've got a playlist that is made just for you. You can check it out right here. I hope to see you guys again in the future. Y'all have a great day.